All right, welcome back to part 4. Dawn has just taken you through parts 2 and 3, where you learned about how to define and teach your expectations in your classroom. In part 4, we're going to talk about using active engagement and instructional management strategies to prevent problem behavior in your classroom. So we're moving beyond these foundational practices and really thinking about, are the proactive and positive classroom practices implemented consistently? And the first of those strategies is what we call opportunities to respond. And the goal is to provide high rates of varied opportunities to respond. So here's an example. In elementary school, we're going to call on individuals or small groups of students and just ask them to respond to instruction. So you can do this by pulling names on sticks out of a jar as questions are posed. You can do this by asking all of students to respond chorally, to recite their letter sounds, or to respond to a particular question. At the secondary level, we can do this exact same strategy, asking students to respond to a prompt or a question during instruction. At the individual or small group level, we could say something like, I just showed you how to do number 1, now you do number 2. You can ask students to come up to the board to complete something. We can also use nonverbal opportunities to respond, where we ask kids to give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or they can even use technology like a clicker to respond and answer a multiple choice question in their classroom. A non-example would be a 20-minute lecture without any opportunities to respond, or without prompting students to do anything during that time. And so what our goal is to provide a lot of opportunities to respond of different types across our instruction to make sure that kids are engaged with us while we're instructing them. Because, as we said in the outset, kids who are engaged in instruction are not engaged in problem behavior. And so this is a proactive strategy that keeps them learning, keeps them engaged in your lesson. So how do we do that? We're going to provide high rates of opportunities to respond, a lot of different types. The key here is to link these opportunities to respond with our instructional objectives. So we've seen some examples in classrooms where teachers like to have kids move around. Movement is fantastic. Asking kids to put their hands on their head while they're reciting something might be fun, it might be a way to keep them engaged, but it's not connected with your learning outcomes. It's not going to be as powerful as an opportunity to respond that asks them to, put up number 2 if you think the answer is B, put up number 3 if you think the answer is C, where they're having to respond, but they're connecting that response to what you're trying to teach. And so whenever possible, we're going to use opportunities to respond that connect kids to the actual instruction that we're trying to deliver. There are a lot of ways to do this, and these are a couple of ways that are supported by research. So computer-assisted instruction gives kids a high rate of opportunities to respond. Choral responding is an example we already gave, where kids all answer together. Class-wide peer tutoring is a really structured response where we teach kids how to teach each other, how to work together as tutors. So they have specific roles that are defined, and kids work together in groups to teach each other, and they take turns being the tutor and the recipient. Electronic clickers we've mentioned as well. Kids can use a clicker or their phones to respond to online surveys. Response cards or whiteboards, anything that students can hold up that says, yes, I know the answer to this, no, I don't know the answer to this, or I think this is what it is. Kids can use nonverbal responses, thumbs up, thumbs down, those sorts of things. And then guided notes, like you have in these modules, are another way of doing an opportunity to respond, where you provide students with a lot of the content, but there are some blanks where students have to fill in the blanks as you go, and that is also an opportunity to respond. All of these are strategies that have a research base behind them that you can use. There are lots of other strategies that you can use in your classroom as well. Again, the idea is a high rate of opportunities to respond with some variety thrown in there, and is, whenever possible, connecting the opportunity to respond to the learning objectives. So we're going to stop for a minute and ask you to think about what other strategies you've seen that engage kids in instruction. So describe all of the different types of opportunities to respond that you've seen or that you've used. And then also start to think about, okay, these are easy things to do in my classroom. How can I, as the teacher, remind myself to do this? Think about things like writing some notes in your lesson plan book, or providing a little sticky note for yourself on the board or on the table where you're teaching that just reminds you to provide a high rate of opportunities to respond. So take a couple minutes and write down some of those notes in your workbook, and we'll be back in just a minute. I hope you had a lot of ideas to write down about opportunities to respond. We want you to remember that these are one strategy to promote active engagement, and the idea is to use a lot of them and to use a variety. So we hope you wrote down lots of different examples. But each of these also has to be connected to good instruction. So for example, computer-assisted instruction definitely produces high rates of opportunities to respond. The computer can ask kids rapid questions in a way that an individual instructor probably can't do. However, it has to be used strategically and probably doesn't replace all instruction. So each of these different examples that we use need to be used carefully and used in conjunction with a larger instructional strategy. All right, next we're going to think a little bit about what we'll call instructional classroom management strategies. And this is a way of thinking about the way we design instruction, but with a behavioral twist. So we're going to think about designing each of our lessons in a way that sort of sets kids up for success by thinking about all of the different dimensions of the tasks that we're asking them to do. So it's a proactive strategy because we're, again, trying to prevent problem behaviors from happening. We're modifying the antecedents that we're providing to kids to make it more likely that they're able to be successful. So think about it. Every activity, every task that you ask students to engage in has all of these different task dimensions. There's a history with this particular task. The task might be brand new to the kid. It could be familiar to them, or it could be something that they've seen a million times. There are different ways we ask them to respond: yes, no, multiple choice, or they have to produce a whole essay or a paragraph in response. There are different modes of responding. They can respond orally, they can respond with the motor skills, they can respond in a written way. There are different task complexities. Is the task really easy? Is it really hard? The schedule, is this a really short task? Is it a really long task? And then there's the variety piece where we think about, is this the exact same task you've been doing all day, or is this something different than the task you did right before it? And each of these task dimensions kind of combine to make some tasks harder or easier than others. And so we're going to use these task dimensions to think through how we set kids up for success. So think about this. Before instruction, we're going to think about ways to promote student engagement and set up tasks that feel doable for students. So think about this. Which of these tasks is more likely to occasion problem behavior? Task A, where it's a brand new task that the kid has never seen before. They have to produce an answer in written form. It's a complex task that takes them a long time to do, and you've been doing this exact same kind of task all day long. Versus task B, where this is something they've seen before. They can answer yes, no. They can do that orally. It's relatively easy for them. It's quick, obviously, and it's different than what you just did before. Now, these are two pretty extreme examples, but which one of these is more likely to set kids up for problem behavior? Hopefully, you're thinking task A, and I would agree. Task A is a much more complicated task, and it's not that we aren't going to give kids complicated tasks, but we have to think about how these different task dimensions combine to set kids up to display problem behavior. Again, if you think back to the function of behavior, one of those functions is to escape or avoid difficult things. Sometimes it's not actually the academic instruction that's difficult, it's these task dimensions and the way we combine them that feels difficult to students. And so we might be able to teach the exact same content using different task dimensions, and we can avoid some of the problem behaviors that may come if we use these more complicated task dimensions. So thinking through those things before you even engage in instruction can help prevent problem behaviors in your classroom. During instruction, we're obviously going to continuously monitor both the instruction and the behaviors, but also this extra layer of these task dimensions. Are the dimensions that we're asking students to engage in the right ones? Are they allowing students to show what they know without making the task more complex than it needs to be? And then after instruction, when you do your reflection on how did that lesson go, and did students learn the academics that you were trying to teach, and were they behaved appropriately, part of your reflection should also be on these task dimensions. To what extent did the way you presented the task contribute to student success or student difficulty as you went through the lesson? So a couple of things to consider. Choice is your friend here. We want to give students lots of different options whenever possible. We want to keep tasks varied. We want to decrease downtime. So thinking about how do we move kids from one task to the next without a lot of transition time in between there. Interspersing easier tasks with more difficult ones will help students feel successful and be more willing to engage in the more complicated tasks that you might have for them to do. And then, of course, we're going to make sure we're matching tasks with the student ability level. None of us want to engage in tasks that feel impossible or that actually are impossible. So we want to make sure we're really thinking about these task dimensions to help us plan our instructional content in a way that sets kids up for success behaviorally. There's a really cool resource that's available at the Missouri PBIS website that we want you to take a couple of minutes and review. It walks you through these different instructional management strategies and helps you think about how to apply them in your classroom. So go to that website, take a look at that resource. It's also in your workbook. Think about how you have used these instructional management strategies or how you've observed other teachers using them, and then share that in a discussion board post so that other people can see how these different things are applied across different classrooms, and then respond and let folks know, oh yeah, that's a great idea, I use that too, I tried it this way. Share your ideas and learn a little bit more about how to use instructional management to support student behavior in your classroom. And we'll come back in a little bit. All right, welcome back. I hope you had gained some new insights through that discussion board post on how to use instructional design to support student behavior. Kind of the big takeaways: remember to think about providing choice whenever possible. We can't always choose which content we're teaching, but we can choose how we present that content and which task dimensions we use. Use a lot of variety of tasks, decrease downtime, and remember to vary your easy and difficult tasks so the students have an opportunity to feel successful and then engage in something more difficult and then try something easier again to kind of regroup as they go through. All right, so as we think about this, remember we want to make sure we're providing a high rate of opportunities to respond. We're going to use prompts and active supervision as our next positive proactive strategies to help prevent problem behaviors in the classroom. And you've actually already talked about these. So you'll remember back in parts 2 and 3, Dawn talked to you about what prompting looked like in the context of a social skills lesson plan. This is exactly the same thing. So when we think about using prompts, we're setting kids up for success. We're reminding them what we want them to do before they're in the situation where they need to use that skill. So at the elementary school level, before they begin seat work, we might think about providing a reminder that says, if you need help during this time, raise your hand or ask for help. And remember how to use our ask for help strategy in our classroom. You can also use visual prompts by just putting a poster of expected behaviors or a particular routine up on the board. At the secondary level, same idea. We're reminding kids what to do before they need to use that particular skill. So when we're thinking about prompting, we're going to do things like review the group activity participation guide before asking kids to work together in a group, or put a sign above the homework bin that says, please check and make sure your name is on this, or whatever other pieces of that work the students need to make sure they turn in. There's a reminder right above that check-in basket that they can use as a prompt. The non-example is waiting until after a student makes an error to correct it. That is not a prompt, that is a corrective, and we'll talk about that later on. But we want to make sure that when we're thinking about prompts, we're remembering that this is something that happens before the student makes a behavioral error. Dawn took you through a variety of different types of prompts, so you'll remember that you can use verbal, gestural, visual, modeling, and physical guidance. You already talked about these in the context of your social skills routine, so you'll remember those pieces. So remember to think through those parts. The next proactive and positive strategy is active supervision. This is, again, a relatively easy strategy to do, and it's another one that you've already talked about earlier in this module, thinking about how do you make sure that you are interacting with kids, moving around the classroom, scanning the classroom, making sure you're always engaged and always kind of pulling kids in and reminding them what they should be doing and acknowledging when they're doing the right thing and making sure they're engaged in appropriate behavior. So active supervision is moving, scanning, and interacting at the elementary school level. When we think about this, it looks like when students are working independently or in centers, you're moving around the classroom and kind of monitoring what they're doing. At the secondary level, same thing. While kids are working individually or in small groups, you're moving around, listening to those interactions, making sure they're on task, redirecting where necessary, and providing encouragement when they need that. It is not sitting or standing where you can't see the entire room, behind your desk, or with your back turned to the group, those sorts of things. And so you'll remember we talked about active supervision when we talked about teaching expectations in your classroom as an important part of the monitor strategy of making sure that we know that kids are performing these behaviors in the context in the classroom where we want them to be able to do it. And so it's moving, scanning the environment, and interacting with students on a regular basis. And we want to make sure we're doing that as often as possible, and particularly during times when you expect that the students might have more difficulty. So during transitions or during group or individual work time, when students might have less structure, that's a time to kind of up your active supervision and make sure that kids are engaged in the instructional activities that they're supposed to be engaged in. All of these strategies need to be adjusted for your particular context and for the cultural background of your particular students. And there's a number of different ways to do this, and we're going to provide a couple of examples when we talk about each individual thing as we go through these modules. But we wanted to give you some resources and ways to think about adjusting instruction to meet the context and the needs of the kids in your particular classroom. There are a number of different resources you can find at PCBS.org that talk about how to do culturally responsive or culturally relevant social skills instruction. Here are a couple of the big ideas. One of the main things is to use explicit instruction, and that is when we directly teach what the social norms are in a particular environment, we allow all kids to kind of start from a level playing field. They know what is expected here, and they all have an equal opportunity to meet that expectation. As opposed to a situation where those expectations haven't been taught explicitly, some students come in and maybe their cultural background matches the norms in the school environment, and another student comes in and their cultural background does not match. They have to then guess what they're supposed to do in that classroom environment. So using explicit instruction is a really important starting place. I want to make sure we build and prime background knowledge whenever possible. You know this from your instructional courses as well, but making sure that kids share the background knowledge, share the vocabulary that you're using so that they can engage in instruction from an equal starting place or from an equitable starting place. Using high rates of opportunity to respond, like we've talked about in this module, keeps kids engaged, and it also gives you as the instructor an opportunity to know who's understanding what you're teaching and who needs more support, because when you've got kids responding quickly with you, then you can adjust your instruction right there on the fly if you need to. And then providing really clear performance feedback, we know, is another really critical piece. That it's important for us to tell kids when they get it right. It's also important for us to give really good feedback when kids make an error. And we'll talk about that in some modules coming up about how we do that. But these are kind of the foundation of how we think about adapting teaching social skills instruction to a particular context. And so we want you to think about those ideas. Check out the resources at PCBS.org that go into more detail about those things to help you think about how do you apply each of these strategies in your classroom in a culturally and contextually relevant way. All right, so in this module we've talked about, or in this part, we've talked about providing high rates of opportunities to respond, how to use prompts and active supervision to prevent problem behaviors in your classroom. And so if you think back to those first two modules, these are antecedent strategies that keep kids from engaging in problem behavior. They prevent problem behaviors from occurring. In the next module, we'll talk about how do we acknowledge appropriate behavior. It's the last of our positive proactive practices that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about that in Module 4.